I started noticing things, small, almost imperceptible at first. Rachel and I had been co-hosting our radio show for years, and we always knew each other's rhythms. We had a routine, a flow, an unspoken understanding of how our days played out. But lately, something had shifted. It wasn't obvious initially, but the signs were there if you knew what to look for. She began staying late at the studio more often than usual. It wasn't completely unheard of. In our line of work, deadlines and technical issues could sometimes throw the schedule off. But the frequency of her late nights became harder to ignore. Each time, she had the same excuse: we're having issues with the sound equipment. I must stay back and work with Dennis to figure it out. The first few times, I didn't question it. I trusted her. Why wouldn't I? We were a team, on air and off. But as the weeks went by, it seemed like the sound equipment was always breaking down, always requiring extra attention, always needing Dennis. Dennis, our sound technician, was a quiet guy, always in the background, handling the technical side of things, never really drawing attention to himself. I'd never given him much thought beyond his job, but now his name began to ring in my ears every time Rachel mentioned him. She seemed to be talking about him more often, too. Little comments about how Dennis saved the day today, or Dennis is the only one who understands how the system works. And then there were the moments when I would ask her about dinner plans or weekend getaways, and she'd casually mention, "Oh, I promised Dennis I'd help him with something at the studio that night." At first, I brushed it off as professional camaraderie. After all, we were all working long hours, and a bit of teamwork wasn't unusual. But it started to gnaw at me. I'd lie awake at night, replaying her words in my head. Was I overreacting? Was I being paranoid? I wasn't the jealous type, but there was something in her tone, in the way her eyes flickered when she talked about staying late. The more I thought about it, the more my unease grew. What if there was something else going on? Something more than just sound problems? Eventually, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know for sure. One night, after she'd told me once again that she needed to stay late to help Dennis fix some mysterious issue with the equipment, I decided to follow her. I didn't tell her, of course. I waited until she left, then I grabbed my jacket, got into my car, and headed to the studio. It felt strange, almost wrong, like I was intruding on her space, violating some unwritten rule of trust between us. But I had to know. The studio was quiet when I arrived, the parking lot nearly empty. I parked far enough away that she wouldn't see my car and walked toward the building, feeling my heart race with every step. The hallway leading to the sound room was dimly lit, casting long shadows on the walls. I could hear the faint hum of equipment in the distance, and as I got closer, I began to pick up voices, low, muffled, but unmistakable. I crept down the corridor, my steps quiet on the tile floor, and stopped just outside the door. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see them. Rachel was leaning over the console, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the soundboard lights, and there was Dennis, standing close, too close, beside her. They were laughing about something, their voices warm and intimate in a way that made my stomach churn. I watched as Rachel playfully swatted his arm, giggling like a schoolgirl, and Dennis responded by brushing her hair out of her face. It was a small gesture, something that might have seemed innocent to an outsider, but to me, it was like a punch to the gut. The way he touched her, the way she allowed him to touch her, it was clear that this wasn't just a professional relationship. There was something between them, something that had been brewing right under my nose for God knows how long. I stood there, frozen, watching the scene unfold, feeling a cocktail of emotions surge through me: anger, betrayal, confusion. My ears burned, and my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Part of me wanted to burst in, to confront them right then and there, to demand an explanation. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something held me back, a mixture of shock and the cold realization that if I revealed myself now, I wouldn't have any real proof, nothing concrete to confront her with. It would be her word against mine, and she was good with words. She could twist the situation, make it seem like I was the one overreacting, like I was imagining things. So I swallowed my pride, turned around, and left quietly. As I walked back to my car, my mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? What else had they done behind my back? And most importantly, how the hell was I going to deal with this? But one thing was certain: Rachel wasn't going to get away with it. I wasn't just going to sit back and let her betray me like that. No, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following week was a haze of quiet fury and relentless focus. After what I had seen, there was no going back. Rachel didn't realize it, but I had become a man on a mission. I couldn't let her betrayal go unnoticed or, worse, unpunished. I needed proof, hard evidence that couldn't be twisted or denied. If I confronted her with nothing more than what I had seen, she'd find a way to manipulate the situation and gaslight me into thinking I'd misunderstood. No, I had to be smarter than that. I had to catch her and Dennis in such a way that there would be no escape. No chance for her to wriggle out of it. It started innocently enough. I began paying closer attention to her phone when she wasn't looking, taking note of her messages whenever she left it lying around. She was careful, though, deleting anything too obvious, and keeping their communication to a minimum during the day. But still, there were little things. Texts from Dennis that were just vague enough to pass as work-related but carried a tone that made my skin crawl. Meet me at the studio after the show? We need to talk about the sound levels. Sure, on the surface, they seemed normal. But after what I had seen that night, I knew better. I didn't stop there. I started lingering around the studio longer than I usually would, pretending to finish up paperwork or tweak something for our next show. I watched them closely, even if they weren't aware of it. I studied the way they moved and the way they interacted when they thought no one was watching. There was a shift in Rachel, an air of secrecy around her that I'd never noticed before. Now that I was paying attention, her laughter was a little too easy when Dennis was around. She stood a little closer to him than necessary. It wasn't overt, but once you'd seen the truth, you couldn't unsee it. Then came the eavesdropping. Our studio wasn't particularly soundproof, and I learned quickly that if I stood in the hallway just right, I could hear what was happening inside. I heard them talking in low voices when they thought I was gone, discussing plans that didn't involve work, personal plans. One afternoon, I caught a snippet of their conversation as I stood just outside the studio door. "I can't keep doing this," Rachel whispered, her voice laced with anxiety. "What if someone finds out?" "They won't," Dennis reassured her, his tone calm like he had everything under control. "We're careful. He doesn't suspect a thing." My blood boiled at his words. Careful? They thought they were being careful? They had no idea. But even overhearing their conversations wasn't enough. I needed something solid, something undeniable. And then, one evening, the opportunity presented itself. I had stayed behind after our show, pretending to wrap up some last-minute edits on the upcoming broadcast. Rachel and Dennis were in the sound booth, thinking I had left for the night. They must have gotten too comfortable, too confident because as I walked past the studio, I noticed that someone had left one of the recording devices running, completely by accident, it seemed. I didn't think much of it at first. But something made me pause. I stepped inside, and there it was, an open file, recording everything they said. I couldn't believe my luck. I quickly scanned the console to see if there was any way to retrieve the file without them noticing. And then I heard it, clear as day, their voices, speaking freely, with no pretense. "I wish we didn't have to sneak around like this," Rachel was saying. "It's exhausting, hiding everything from him." Dennis chuckled. "Sooner or later, it'll come out. He'll have to know eventually." Rachel's voice grew more anxious. "No, we can't let that happen. If he finds out, it'll destroy everything." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Destroy everything. She was right. It would destroy everything, but not in the way she thought. At that moment, listening to her, a plan began to form in my mind. A plan that would ensure their little secret didn't stay hidden much longer. I didn't just want to confront her in private, that would be too easy. Too forgettable. I wanted the world to know. I wanted her humiliation to be public, just like her betrayal. With trembling hands, I copied the recording onto a flash drive, making sure it was saved before I erased the file from the studio's system. I couldn't afford to leave any trace of what I had done. When I walked out of that room, the USB drive felt heavy in my pocket, like it held the weight of everything that had transpired. I had the evidence now, undeniable proof of her affair with Dennis. But I wasn't ready to use it just yet. Not until I could do it in a way that would make an impact. Over the next few days, I continued to gather more emails left open on her laptop, more overheard conversations, and subtle comments exchanged during the day. Piece by piece, I was constructing a case against her, and all the while, Rachel had no idea. She went on as if everything was fine, smiling at me across the breakfast table, making small talk during our breaks at the station, completely oblivious to the fact that I knew the truth. And the more I thought about it, the clearer my plan became. I wouldn't just confront her. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of a private argument where she could cry and apologize and twist things in her favor. No, this was going to be much bigger than that. I was going to expose her where it hurt the most, on the air, in front of our listeners, during one of our most popular live broadcasts. I could see it all unfolding in my mind, the shock on her face, the panic in her eyes, the way she would try to cover it up but fail miserably. The listeners would hear every word, every damning sentence from the recordings I'd saved. She wouldn't be able to deny it. And Dennis? Well, he'd be caught in the crossfire too. I knew it was a dangerous game I was playing. The fallout would be massive, not just for her, but for me as well. But I didn't care anymore. Betrayal of this magnitude deserved nothing less than a full-scale reckoning. I could feel the anticipation building inside me as the day of the show approached. I rehearsed the moment in my head, and played it over and over again, making sure I had every detail right. There would be no mistakes. This would be Rachel's moment of reckoning, and I was going to make sure it was unforgettable. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. We had one of our most important shows coming up, the evening slot, the one that brought in the highest ratings. It was a fan favorite, a time when listeners from all over tuned in. Some of them had been following us for years, loyal to the point of obsession. They would write letters, call in with comments, and even debate our topics online long after the show ended. This was the perfect stage. If I wanted to make a statement, to bring Rachel's world crashing down around her, this was the moment. The stage was set for something truly unforgettable. I had spent the past few days quietly rehearsing how everything would play out, running through every possible scenario in my head. I imagined her shock, the instant realization that she was caught. The way her smile would falter when she realized that this wasn't just another show, it was the end of the facade. We had done this show hundreds of times before. It was routine, almost mechanical for us at this point. We'd greet the listeners, introduce the topic of the day, play some music, and banter back and forth like the perfect duo everyone thought we were. Rachel had always been a natural on air, her voice smooth and engaging, her laugh contagious. The audience loved her, they loved us. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that underneath that polished exterior, beneath the chemistry and charm, was the cold, hard truth of her betrayal. As the day of the show approached, I played it cool, pretending that nothing was amiss. I smiled when I was supposed to, kept the conversation light, and even made a few jokes like I usually did. If Rachel noticed anything different, she didn't show it. She was as cheerful and professional as always, completely unaware of the storm that was about to break. The night of the broadcast she has finally arrived. I could feel the tension building inside me as we prepped for the show, going over the segment plan, adjusting our microphones, and making sure everything was in place. The studio felt smaller than usual, the walls closing in around us as the weight of what I was about to do settled on my shoulders. I watched Rachel out of the corner of my eye, her movements as fluid and confident as ever. She was dressed perfectly, her hair falling in soft waves. Her makeup flawless. She looked like the Rachel everyone knew and loved. The Rachel who had been deceiving me for God knows how long. But none of that mattered now. Tonight, all of it would come to an end. As the clock ticked closer to showtime, I could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline that always came before we went live. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just the excitement of the show. It was the anticipation of the fallout, the knowledge that by the end of the hour, everything would have changed. I had everything ready. The flash drive with their damning conversations was safely tucked away in my pocket, waiting for the right moment. I had planned it down to the second. During our regular music break, I would slip the recording into the system, and the rest would take care of itself. There would be no stopping it once it started. The recording would play, and Rachel's secrets would spill out into the airwaves for everyone to hear. There would be no way for her to cover it up. No way to deny it. Her betrayal would be public, undeniable, and devastating. As the final minutes before the show ticked away, I looked over at Rachel one last time. She was sitting at her mic, adjusting her headphones, completely oblivious to what was coming. I almost felt a pang of guilt, almost. But then I remembered the way she had laughed with Dennis, the way she had lied to my face, and any trace of sympathy evaporated. She had made her choices, and now it was time for her to face the consequences. The red light above the door flicked on, signaling that we were alive. The familiar sound of our theme music filled the studio, and I could hear Rachel's voice slide effortlessly into her usual introduction, warm and inviting as if nothing was wrong. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's show. As always, we've got a great one lined up for you. We'll be taking calls, playing some of your favorite tracks, and diving into the topics you've all been asking about. She was perfect, polished, professional, the voice everyone loved. I couldn't help but marvel at how easily she could slip into that role, knowing what she had been doing behind the scenes. It was like watching an actress on stage, performing her lines flawlessly, even as the curtain was about to fall. I followed her lead, jumping in with my usual banter, pretending like everything was normal. My voice sounded steady, even though inside, my heart was pounding. I could feel the flash drive in my pocket, a small but powerful reminder of what was about to unfold. The listeners had no idea that this wasn't just another evening of lighthearted entertainment. They had no idea that they were about to witness the unraveling of a lie that had been carefully constructed over months, maybe even years. As we moved through the first segment, I could feel the tension building. Rachel was in her element, chatting with listeners, throwing in little quips that made everyone laugh, completely unaware of the ticking time bomb sitting next to her. Every word that came out of her mouth felt like a lie. Every smile a reminder of the betrayal that had brought us to this moment. I played along, keeping up the facade, but inside, I was counting down the minutes until the music break. That was when it would happen. That was when I would make my move. Finally, the time came. Rachel wrapped up her latest commentary, and the cue for our first music break appeared on the screen. She smiled at me, a smile so fake it made my stomach turn, and I returned it with one of my own, equally hollow, equally deceptive. And now, let's take a quick break and listen to one of our favorite tracks. Don't go anywhere, we'll be right back with more calls and stories. The second the music started playing, I reached into my pocket, my fingers curling around the flash drive. This was it. This was the moment I had been waiting for. With a steady hand, I slid the drive into the slot, quickly navigating the system to ensure the recording would play as soon as the music ended. Rachel was leaning back in her chair, sipping water and scrolling through her notes, completely unaware that her world was about to implode. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, the private conversations she had shared with Dennis, conversations she thought were safely hidden, would be broadcast to thousands of listeners. She had no idea that the carefully crafted image she had built over the years was about to be shattered in the most public way possible. The music continued to play, but in my mind, I was already hearing the fallout. The shock, the confusion, the betrayal, all of it was coming. And there was no way to stop it now. As the familiar song played through the studio, I felt the weight of what I was about to do settling in. It was time. The music pulsed through the speakers, filling the room, as Rachel sat across from me, completely oblivious to the fact that her entire world was about to crumble. She casually flipped through her notes, taking a sip of water, while I reached into my pocket and pulled out the flash drive. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady as I plugged it into the system. I navigated the controls carefully, making sure everything was in place. This was the moment I had been planning for, the one that would bring all the lies, all the secrets crashing down in front of our entire audience. I had chosen the part of the recording where they were at their most brazen. In those conversations, Rachel and Dennis weren't just sneaking around, they were laughing about it, mocking me. Talking about how clever they were for hiding their affair right under my nose. I could still hear their voices, dripping with arrogance and disdain, as they discussed how easily I had been fooled. I found the exact spot in the recording where Dennis joked about me being clueless and Rachel laughed, agreeing that he'll never figure it out. That was the moment I wanted. That was the moment that would cut the deepest, not just for me, but for anyone listening. The listeners who had adored Rachel would hear her for what she truly was, deceitful, manipulative, and cold. The perfect mask she had worn for so long was about to be ripped away, and I was going to be the one to do it. I glanced over at Rachel one last time. She was completely calm, in her element, waiting for the music to end so we could resume the show. She had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything was going to change. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what came next. There was no turning back now. With the recording loaded and ready to play, I sat back and waited for the music to finish. The seconds seemed to drag on, each one bringing me closer to the moment when I would finally reveal the truth. I could feel the adrenaline pumping through my veins, my body tense with anticipation. I had rehearsed this in my mind 100 times, and now it was about to become reality. The music faded out, leaving a momentary silence in the studio. This was the moment. I reached over and paused for just a second, my finger hovering over the button that would unleash the truth. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, filling the air between us. I could feel Rachel's eyes on me, waiting for me to speak, but instead of the usual transition back into our scripted banter, I let the silence linger for just a little longer. And then, without another word, I pressed play. For a brief second, there was nothing but static, then their voices filled the airwaves. Dennis's smug, confident tone came through loud and clear, "He'll never know. It's almost too easy." Rachel's voice followed, soft but unmistakable. "I know. Can you believe how clueless he is? He hasn't suspected a thing." The words hung in the air, venomous and damning. I watched Rachel's face as the realization hit her. At first, she looked confused, her eyes darting to the console as if something had gone wrong. But then, as the words continued to play, her expression shifted from confusion to horror. The color drained from her face, her skin turning ashen as the weight of what was happening hit her all at once. "This is life," she whispered, barely able to form the words. I didn't respond. I just sat there, watching her fall apart as the recording continued. Dennis and Rachel went on, talking about how they had hidden their affair, how they'd snuck around behind my back, mocking me with every word. It was all out there now, no more hiding, no more pretending. The audience was hearing everything, every cruel, calculated comment, every betrayal laid bare for the world to see. Rachel's hand shot out, fumbling with the controls, trying desperately to stop the recording, to end the nightmare that was unfolding in front of her. But it was too late. The damage had been done. Even if she managed to cut the broadcast now, there was no erasing what people had already heard. The listeners, the fans who had trusted her, who had believed in her, had heard the truth. Her hands were trembling as she struggled with the equipment, her face a mask of panic and disbelief. "Turn it off," she gasped, her voice frantic. "Turn it off." But I didn't move. I let the recording play on, let the damning evidence continue to pour out into the airwaves. I wanted her to hear it all, to feel the full weight of what she had done. I wanted her to understand that there was no escaping this, no more lying, no more pretending. By now, the phone lines were lighting up. The switchboard was flooded with calls, listeners desperate to know what was happening. They were hearing the private conversations of their beloved radio hosts, and they couldn't believe their ears. The studio was in chaos, but I remained calm, my eyes locked on Rachel as she spiraled into panic. Her breathing was shallow, her hands shaking as she finally managed to cut the feed. The recording stopped abruptly, leaving the studio in a stunned silence. For a moment, neither of us moved. Rachel stared at the console, her chest rising and falling rapidly as she tried to process what had just happened. But the silence didn't last long. The phones were still ringing, the listeners demanding answers. And Rachel knew that there was no coming back from this. The moment Rachel cut the recording, an eerie silence settled over the studio, but it lasted only for a few seconds. Then, chaos erupted. The phone lines lit up like fireworks, call after call flooding in, as if the listeners had been waiting, holding their collective breath for the dam to break. I glanced at the switchboard, every single line was blinking, the sheer volume of incoming calls overwhelming the system. It was like a tidal wave of reactions crashing against us, each one a raw, unfiltered response to the disaster I had just unleashed on live radio. The listeners couldn't believe what they had just heard. These were people who had tuned in expecting another casual evening of light banter, a bit of music, and maybe a couple of laughs. Instead, they had stumbled into a scandal, something so personal, so ugly, that it felt like they were eavesdropping on a private argument rather than enjoying a radio show. The first few calls were filled with shock. The voices that came through were hesitant at first, uncertain. Did I hear that right?" a woman asked, her voice shaking. Were those your voices? Is this real?" She couldn't even finish her thought. The disbelief was thick in her tone, as if she was trying to wrap her mind around the fact that the people she had followed for years, the voices she trusted every evening, were now tangled in such a scandal. And then, as if the floodgates had opened, more calls came pouring in. Some listeners were angry, furious even. "How could you do that?" One man barked through the line, his voice dripping with disgust. "We trusted you all this time, and you were lying to us, living a lie. What kind of people are you?" The sense of betrayal was palpable. These weren't just random listeners. These were the people who had been with us from the beginning, who had invested in the personas we had created, who had bought into the idea of us. And now, the perfect duo they thought they knew was shattered. Some, however, took my side, their voices filled with empathy and outrage on my behalf. "Max, I don't know how you held it together for so long," one woman said, her voice soft but steady. "What she did to you, it's unforgivable. I can't believe I ever liked her. You didn't deserve that." There was an outpouring of sympathy from listeners who could hear the betrayal in the recording, who were stunned by Rachel's cruelty. But it wasn't all sympathy. Many listeners were quick to turn their anger toward me as well. "This is just as much your fault, Max," one caller accused. "You didn't have to air this out in public. What kind of person humiliates someone like that? You've ruined your career, both of you. It's disgusting." That accusation hit hard, but I didn't flinch. I had expected backlash, the kind that would cut both ways. This wasn't about coming out unscathed. It was about the truth, and I was prepared for the mess that came with it. As more and more calls came in, the studio descended into a chaotic blur of voices. Some clamoring for more details, others demanding explanations, while a few just wanted to voice their sheer disbelief at the situation. Each call seemed more frantic than the last, the noise from the switchboard a constant reminder of the storm I had unleashed. Through it all, Rachel sat frozen in her chair. Her face, pale and tight with shock, was a mask of disbelief. She looked as though she had been struck, completely blindsided by the enormity of the situation. It was as if she had not yet fully processed what had just happened. Her hands were still trembling, her fingers nervously tapping the edge of the desk. Now and then, she would glance toward the phone lines, as though expecting one of the calls to somehow offer a lifeline, a way out. But none came. For the first time, Rachel, confident, charismatic Rachel, was speechless. She didn't have a single word to say. Her lips parted as though she might try to speak, to explain herself, but nothing came. No defense, no apology, nothing. She was trapped in the reality I had forced upon her. I could see her struggling to compose herself, but the damage was done. The carefully constructed image she had built, the one that had charmed our listeners for so long, was crumbling in real time, and there was no way to stop it. Her eyes darted toward me, pleading silently for some kind of reprieve, but I offered none. This was her mess. She had made her choices, and now she was reaping the consequences. The phones continued to ring incessantly, each call's a reflection of the emotional spectrum we had just detonated across our audience. Some listeners were confused, unable to reconcile the version of Rachel they had known with the woman they had just heard on that damning recording. Others wanted blood, they wanted more, pressing for details, for the gritty, sordid story behind the affair. The air was thick with tension, and even though I had been expecting this reaction, it still hit harder than I anticipated. At that moment, the studio felt small and suffocating. The walls seemed to close in as the weight of everything pressed down on us. I could hear the muffled voices of the producers through the glass, frantically discussing how to handle the deluge of calls and the fallout from what had just transpired. There was no putting the genie back in the bottle. The scandal had spilled out, raw and untamed, and there was no controlling it now. For a brief second, I felt the overwhelming enormity of what I had done. I had detonated a bomb, and now we were both sitting in the wreckage. But then, as I looked over at Rachel, still reeling, I felt something cold and steady settle inside me. This was justice. The chaos in the studio eventually gave way to an eerie, suffocating silence. The phone lines were still lighting up, but I had stopped paying attention to the flashing lights. I had stopped hearing the muffled voices of our producers, the distant buzz of the newsroom. All of it faded into the background as I sat there, staring at Rachel. The switchboard still blinked with calls, listeners who had questions, anger, and disbelief. But none of it mattered anymore. The show, as it had been, was over. The facade we had maintained for so long, the persona we had built for our audience, had been shattered in the most brutal, public way possible. Rachel was utterly still. The confident, sharp-witted woman I had worked with for years, who always knew exactly what to say, was frozen in place. Her hands were clenched in her lap, her face pale, drained of any of the color that once defined her vitality. Her eyes stared blankly ahead, unseeing, as though her mind was still struggling to catch up with the magnitude of what had just happened. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The weight of the truth, now fully exposed to the world, hung between us like a thick fog. I could see her chest rising and falling, her breath shallow, as if she were trying to steady herself. But the shock had rooted her to her chair, and she didn't move. I reached for the microphone, my movements slow and deliberate. With a click, I turned it off. The sound of the switch echoing through the suddenly cavernous studio. The silence felt even heavier now, pressing down on both of us. I turned toward her, my eyes meeting hers across the desk. Her lips parted slightly, as though she might say something, but no words came. It was as if everything she had once been able to control, to manipulate, was slipping through her fingers, and she was powerless to stop it. "Now you're really on the air," I said, my voice low but clear. There was no anger in my words. No trace of the pain or betrayal I had felt. It was just a simple statement of fact, a reminder that the truth, for once, had not been hidden behind carefully scripted lines or polished radio personalities. This was Rachel, exposed, without the gloss of charm or the protection of her persona. This was the reality of her deceit, laid bare for everyone to see. She stared at me, her eyes wide, and for a moment, I saw something flicker in her expression, fear, maybe, or perhaps shame. But it was fleeting, disappearing as quickly as it had come. She was too stunned, too overwhelmed, to respond. I stood up slowly, the sound of my chair scraping against the floor and cutting through the thick silence. As I rose, I felt a strange sense of calm settle over me, a finality to it all. This was the end, the culmination of everything I had planned, everything I had endured. And now, there was nothing left to say. Rachel's gaze followed me, her eyes pleading for some kind of explanation, some reassurance. But I offered none. There was nothing I could say that would change what had happened, nothing that would undo the humiliation, the exposure. She had made her choices, and this was the consequence. As I walked toward the door, the studio felt smaller, as if the weight of what had just transpired had compressed the air around us. The walls seemed to close in, trapping Rachel in her seat, while I moved toward the exit with a sense of release. My hand reached for the door handle, and for the briefest second, I hesitated, my mind flicked back to all the moments we had shared in that room, moments that, until now, had seemed real. But it was all a lie. Without another word, I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Behind me, Rachel remained seated, her figure small and unmoving in the dim light of the studio. She didn't call out, didn't ask me to stay. She just sat there, her mind undoubtedly racing, trying to piece together how it had all come crashing down so fast, so brutally. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing her inside. For a moment, I stood there, the cool air of the hallway washing over me, grounding me in the present. I could still hear the faint sounds of the phone lines ringing inside the studio, the remnants of the chaos I had left behind. But I didn't turn back. I didn't need to see what came next, because I already knew. Rachel would sit there in stunned silence, her career, her image, everything she had built, crumbling around her. The listeners would keep calling and the producers would scramble to contain the fallout. But none of it mattered to me anymore. My part in this was over. With each step I took away from the studio, the weight that had been pressing on my chest for weeks began to lift. I had done what I came to do. The truth was out, and there was no going back. The morning after the broadcast, the world felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air as I made my way to the station. The usual buzz of anticipation, the routine chatter of colleagues preparing for the day, was gone. Instead, there was a heavy, uncomfortable silence. News had already spread far beyond our regular listeners. Word of the scandal had made its way into headlines, social media feeds, and office gossip. People were talking, speculating, and dissecting every detail. What had happened the night before wasn't just another slip-up, it was a full-blown catastrophe, and everyone knew it. When I arrived at the station, the doors were closed. A hastily written sign on the glass entrance read, "Broadcast temporarily suspended." There would be no show today or for the foreseeable future. A corporate investigation had been launched, they said, but I knew that was just a formality. The real damage had already been done, and no amount of internal reviews or public statements could undo it. The station, our show, her show, really, was dead. And I had killed it. Inside, the mood was somber. People whispered in the halls, their eyes darting toward me as I walked past. No one dared to say anything out loud, but I could feel their gazes burning into my back. Some of them pitied me, I was sure, Others probably blamed me for how I had handled things. I didn't care. None of their opinions mattered. Rachel, however, was nowhere to be seen. I had expected her to stay away. After what happened on air, there was no way she could walk back into this building with her head held high. Her absence spoke volumes. She had lost everything: her credibility, her image, the respect of her peers, and perhaps worst of all, the trust of the audience she had charmed for years. Once the investigation began, it didn't take long for the details to leak out. People knew about the affair now. The recordings I had played on air had done more than just reveal her betrayal, they had obliterated her reputation. No amount of spinning or damage control could fix that. Rachel was finished in the industry. She would never recover from this, not fully. For someone like her, whose entire career was built on her public persona, that kind of fall was devastating. The phone calls, the headlines, the whispers, it would all follow her wherever she went. She had been exposed in the most public, humiliating way possible, and no one was likely to forget it. I thought I would feel triumphant, victorious. After all, this was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To make her pay for what she had done, to strip away the mask she wore every day, and to show the world who she was. In a way, I had succeeded. But the victory tasted hollow, tainted by something darker than I had anticipated. As I sat in the now empty office that used to buzz with energy, I reflected on what I had done. There was a part of me, deep down, that had believed revenge would bring closure, that exposing Rachel for the liar she was would somehow balance the scales. And yet, sitting there in the aftermath, I realized how naive that had been. Yes, I had destroyed her. She had deserved it, no question about that. But in doing so, I had also destroyed something within myself. The satisfaction I had imagined would come with revenge wasn't there. Instead, it had left me feeling empty, as if the cost had been far greater than I anticipated. The bitter truth hit me then: revenge might be sweet at the moment, but it leaves a lingering aftertaste, one that clings to you long after the act is done. It's the kind of bitterness that doesn't wash away easily. It lingers in your thoughts, in the quiet moments when you're alone with nothing but your actions to reflect on. I had wanted her to feel the same pain I did, to know what it was like to be betrayed, humiliated, and made a fool of in front of everyone. And she did. I saw it in her eyes during the broadcast, in the way her face drained of color, in the tremble of her hands. But in the end, what had I gained? The satisfaction I had craved was fleeting, replaced by a heavy sense of loss. The show was gone, suspended indefinitely. Maybe it would come back someday in a different form, but it wouldn't be the same. The chemistry, the dynamic, everything that made us the #1 radio duo, gone. And Rachel? She was nothing more than a ghost now, a cautionary tale in the industry. As for me, I didn't know what the future held. There would be consequences, of course, there always are. Whether I liked it or not, I had become part of the scandal, and no one comes out of something like this completely unscathed. But more than that, I had to live with what I'd done. The world might move on, but I wouldn't forget. That bitter aftertaste of revenge stayed with me, long after the microphones were turned off. Long after the lights in the studio dimmed. It was a reminder, a constant echo in my mind, that no victory is without its cost. And though I had thought Rachel would be the only one to pay the price, I now realized that I, too, had lost something along the way.